Pemberley Ranch. Written by Jack Caldwell. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Prologue. Vicksburg, Mississippi, May 22nd, 1863. The day was several hot, stifling hours old when the young, gray-clad captain of infantry once again peeked carefully over the ramparts of his position into the morning sun, telescope in hand. Yet again he saw nothing, but he was not deceived. Since the initial assault upon their location 3 days ago, the enemy had tirelessly moved men and material into position for another attack. The sounds of horses and cannon wheels had been constant since before daybreak. The heavily wooded hilly terrain was not only perfect for defense, but also for hiding the maneuvers of their attacker. "Them Yankee boys are getting ready to come a-visitin' again, Captain?" a voice whispered into his ear. William Darcy, captain in the Texas Legion, Confederate States Army, turned his bright blue eyes to his sergeant beside him and wiped a dirty hand across his beard-covered chin before answering. "My compliments to the colonel, and report that the enemy is moving forward." No sooner had the man offered the barest of salutes and moved away from the front lines than the woods opposite exploded with noise. Darcy's screams of warning were unnecessary, as men ducked from the incoming cannon fire. Darcy lay at the bottom of the trench like the others, keeping his head as low as possible. On an impulse, the 20-year-old officer pulled out the pocket watch his father had given him for his birthday 2 years before. 10 o'clock exactly. The cannonballs began to fall behind the lines toward Vicksburg itself. Darcy knew what that was about even before the cries of the enemy reached his ears. He pulled out his sword and stood in a low crouch. "To the line, boys! To the line! The enemy is upon us! Give 'em hell!" The bedraggled Texans in various uniforms of Confederate gray rushed to the ramparts, muskets in hand, screaming the rebel yell that had terrified more than one Union soldier since Bull Run. Just in time, too, as the first of the men in blue were mere yards away. Darcy's view of the attackers disappeared behind a cloud of smoke as the muskets fired in a volley. The smoke cleared to show a score of figures in dirty blue scattered on the bare ground before the earthworks, but there were 100 more advancing. The first line of defenders fell back to reload as the second line took their places. "Fire at will!" Darcy yelled as he drew his Colt revolver. "Fire at will!" Time lost all meaning as Darcy fired into the advancing horde again and again. The Texans knew that their position, straddling a rail line, was a key point in the defense of Vicksburg, and they fought desperately against the Union soldiers, who were just as desperate to take it. The din was deafening as gunfire, explosions, and screams blended into an unearthly sound. Darcy had ducked down to reload his pistol for the 3rd time when he noted that the noise had abated a bit. Creeping up, he saw through the smoke and haze that the Yankees were pulling back in good order. He ordered his men to cease firing and conserve their precious ammunition as he glanced at his watch again. 10:15. Darcy and his company had been relieved about midday as fresh troops took up their position in the lunette. They were resting as well as they could, with the occasional cannonball falling throughout the afternoon, when they were approached by a group of officers on horseback. The commander of the Legion, Colonel Wall, spoke to them. "Men, we've got some Yankees that have broken through at the redoubt. They're a stubborn bunch, and I need some volunteers to help clear the vermin out. Are you with me?" Darcy looked at his men. "Sir, how many do you need?" "A score will do, Captain. We muster down the lane here." With that, the party rode off. Darcy rose to his feet and looked around. A good 24 men volunteered, and soon the detail moved off to the rendezvous point. They joined up with others, and the plan was formed. By late afternoon, the force moved into position near the railroad redoubt. Darcy could see men in blue hiding in the trenches or behind shelter. He knew this assault would be costly. A shout went up, and the Texans charged. Darcy ran before his men, the Colt in his right hand and a sword in his left. The men to either side fired their muskets on the run and continued the charge, bayonets gleaming in the afternoon light. The enemy returned fire from their positions, but even as men fell around him, Darcy knew it was too little, too late. They were almost upon them. The Union soldiers began to fall back in some disorder. Darcy bared his teeth as he smelled the impending victory. There was a mighty explosion, and Darcy experienced a feeling of flying before the world crashed into his face. Will Darcy knew nothing, except that he hurt all over, hurt bad. After a while, he was able to discern something besides the ever-present pain, a low murmuring in the background of his darkness. It took a moment before he realized it was the sound of men groaning and crying. Darcy opened his eyes to behold a dark, uneven ceiling, lit by the light of lanterns. He suddenly realized that he could only see out of one eye. In a panic, he raised a hand to his face and tried to sit up. A wave of agony crashed into him, and he could not prevent crying out as he fell back. Darcy heard voices close by. Doc, this one's waking up." A moment later, a face came into his limited field of vision. "Captain, how are you feeling?" "Like I'm about to die," his mind screamed. He peered closely at the man. About Darcy's own age, the young man had a broad, flushed face and light-colored hair. It was a face that usually would be happy, he considered. That it wasn't was a cause for concern. "Hurt," was all Darcy could manage. "I should think you do," the unknown man said in a soft Georgia accent, with a hint of a smile. The break in the man's serious mien was comforting. Darcy waved a hand before his face. I... "Rest easy," the man said. "Your eyes are undamaged. You have a serious injury to your forehead, and the bandage must cover one eye. You're in hospital, Captain, in a cave to protect y'all from the incoming artillery. Don't sit up," he cried as Darcy moved. "Do you want to lose that leg?" His patient lay still in fear. The man grew grim. "Good thing you were insensible when your men brought you in. I had to do a bit of digging to get all the shrapnel out. You've lost quite a bit of blood, Captain. We must keep your leg still and clean, or the gangrene may set in. Do you understand?" Darcy managed a nod, which only hurt like blazes. He determined he was speaking to a surgeon, as he could now make out the dried blood all over the man's apron. "Good." The doctor grinned in return. "I must see to my other patients, but I shall stop by later. Rest, sir, and you'll be up and walking again." As the doctor began to turn, Darcy fought to speak. "Thanks, Darcy." The doctor turned in surprise. "I beg your pardon?" Darcy gestured again. Darcy." "Ah," the man breathed in realization. "Captain Darcy, is it?" Darcy nodded. He smiled. "Charles Bingley, at your service." Meryton, Ohio, June 20th. Beth, come back!" The 13-year-old girl disregarded her mother's voice as she ran out the back door. Almost blinded by her tears, She managed to reach the large chestnut tree next to the barn without running into anything. The girl threw herself against the trunk, her body shuddering in sobs. It was there her older sister found her, kneeling by the tree. Wordlessly, the blonde girl gathered her sister into her arms, their hair blowing in the breeze. "Beth, oh, Beth," she tried to console the child. "He can't be dead," Beth Bennet sobbed. "Samuel can't be dead. He can't be, Jane." "Beth," Jane began. "He promised to come back. You heard him. He promised." Jane bit her lip as she continued to stroke Beth's curly brown hair, her own tears quietly streaming down her face. She could hear her mother and sisters wailing in the house, an uproar that began a half-hour before, as her father read the words of that hated telegram. "We regret to inform you that—" "Beth, oh, Beth," was all Jane could manage. Her own distress was great. Samuel Bennet, the eldest of the Bennet children and the only son, proud corporal of the Ohio Infantry, gone to save the Union as part of the mighty Army of the Potomac, had died of influenza in Maryland. Samuel was beloved by all of his family, but Beth was particularly fond of him. Jane might be Beth's confidant, but Samuel was her hero and could do no wrong. Jane could only hold her sister, allowing her to cry herself out. Finally, as Beth's sobs subsided, Jane said, "Beth, we must return to the house and see to our parents and sisters. We cannot add to their distress. We must be strong, Beth." "Samuel was always strong, Jane." "Yes, he was. Now it's our turn. Our family needs us." She took the girl's face in her hands. "It is what he would want." Beth nodded. Their mother loved her only son almost as fiercely as Beth, and their father doted on him. They would be shattered, leaving their 3 younger sisters little comfort. Jane got to her feet and helped Beth up. Hand in hand, they turned to return to the house. As they walked, Jane heard Beth mumble something and asked her about it. "I said it is their fault, Jane," she spat. "Whose fault?" "Those damned rebels." "Beth, please," Jane cried. "Please don't talk like that in front of Mother or Mary. You know how they feel about coarse language." "Very well, but I'll never forgive those evil slave-owning rebels. Never. It's their fault Samuel went away. Those evil, evil people. I hope God smites them. I hate them. I will hate them for the rest of my life." Vicksburg, July 4th. Will Darcy sat up in his cot, listening to the cannons going off. He turned to the doctor sitting beside him. "I suppose it's noon, Charles?" Dr. Bingley checked his pocket watch. "Yes, it is. Precise, aren't they, these Yankees?" Darcy sighed, flexing his body. His recovery from the wounds he suffered in May had been hampered by a persistent fever. He had only grown strong enough in the last week to go to the chamber pot unaided. He desperately wanted to return to his command, but now it was too late. Confederate Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton had surrendered Vicksburg to Union Major General Ulysses S. Grant after a 42-day siege, which brought suffering and starvation to troops and civilians alike inside the ramparts. Pemberton had no choice. He had tons of ammunition, but virtually no food. They could hold out no longer. "We've already furled banners and stacked arms. We were to do that before the Yankees took possession of the city," Bingley observed. "I'm told we're to get parole." He patted the captain on the arm. "We get to go home, Will." "Maybe." In the last month, Bingley spent all of his free time with Darcy, playing cards or telling stories, and they had developed a deep friendship. Before Bingley could ask his morose companion his meaning, There was a noise at the entrance of the cave. "I'd best see to that." He excused himself. Darcy watched him walk off to the exit of the ward, when the doctor was pushed back by 3 blue-clad soldiers. "Here, what's this?" Bingley cried. "This is a hospital." "That's for us to see, Johnny Reb," drawled a private. "We're to secure this place and take prisoner any stragglers," said another. Bingley grew angry. "These are all wounded or ill men. Be quick about your business and leave." The third man waved a pistol. "The only one leaving, mister, is you." "I'm a doctor, and these are my patients. I won't leave." The soldiers ignored him and began searching the belongings of the patients. "What are you doing?" "Searching for contraband," said what appeared to be the leader of the band as he fingered a pocket-knife. He put the object into his pocket and picked up a book. One of his fellows laughed. "Contraband! Oh, good one, Pike." "Since when is a man's Bible contraband?" Bingley cried. He moved to confront the man Pike. "Put that back." Suddenly Pike drew a knife. "Resisting the surrender, mister," he growled dangerously. "You don't want to be doing that. No, sir." During the whole time Darcy had lain quietly, pretending to be asleep, all the while slowly reaching beneath his cot. As Pike gestured at Bingley with his knife to the enjoyment of his fellows, Darcy whipped out his saber and threw himself at their tormentors. Sweeping backhanded, he struck one on the head with the pommel, stunning the man before grasping Pike with his left arm about his throat, threatening him with the sword, and using him as a shield against the last soldier. Darcy stared at the third man with a cold, deadly look. "You will not threaten the doctor while I live." "Don't do anything!" cried Pike. "He'll kill me." "No, he won't," came a voice from the entrance to the ward. "Drop that sword, Johnny Reb." Darcy turned, forcing Pike between him and the new threat. He saw a dark-haired man in a blue captain's uniform holding a pistol on him from his left hand. "I am Captain Darcy," Darcy said in his best command voice. "Are you in charge of this rabble?" "I am, Captain. My name is Whitehead. Release that man, or I shall be forced to shoot you." "Your men, Captain, were stealing from sick and wounded men, and were about to attack a doctor. This is strictly against the rules of war. Tell them to stand down." Captain Whitehead's mouth twisted into an amused grin under his pencil-thin mustache. "Were they? Very well." Whitehead barked out an order, and the 2 Yankee soldiers backed away, holstering their pistols. "Good enough, Captain." Darcy hesitated a moment, then slowly withdrew his strong left arm from Pike's throat. Pushing the frightened corporal away, Darcy reversed his sword and offered the pommel to Whitehead. "My sword, sir. I am yours to command." Whitehead holstered his pistol and took the weapon. "A fine saber, Captain. Where on earth did you get it?" "It's Spanish, sir. Fine Toledo steel. It's been in my family for 4 generations. Whitehead inspected the workmanship with ill-disguised envy. "You would hate to lose it, I am sure. Well, have no fears, Captain." Whitehead glanced at his men standing behind Darcy and nodded. Bingley saw the man move to his friend and cried a warning, but it was too late. A moment later, Darcy lay sprawled insensible on the cave floor. Bingley tried to help, but a soldier seized him, pinning his arms behind his back. Whitehead walked over to the prone man and laughed. "Yes, Captain. I would not concern yourself over your sword. You'll have no need for it where you're going." He turned to his remaining men. "Take this man prisoner. Hold." As the 2 lifted Darcy from the ground, Whitehead rifled through the unconscious man's pockets. "You bastard!" cried Bingley as he struggled in the soldier's grip. You're no better than a common thief." "Now, now, Doctor," Whitehead remarked as he withdrew Darcy's pocket watch. "There's nothing common about me at all. Besides," he turned to Bingley, "you're a rebel and a traitor. You're fortunate that I don't shoot you out of hand where you stand." "You won't get away with this," Bingley vowed. "Oh, I think I will. You are nothing. I'd keep quiet if you value your parole." Bingley threw a rather strong curse at Whitehead, and the officer lost all good humor. "Very well, Doctor. Take him away, boys." July 5th. Major General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the victorious Army of the Tennessee, sighed as he enjoyed an after-supper cigar and whiskey in his tent with his friend and subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, Major General of Volunteer and commander of his 15 Corps. Sherman puffed his cigar. "I told you, Grant, that if you stayed in the Army, some happy accident might restore you to favor and your true place. Well, when news of this victory reaches Washington, you'll be the toast of the nation. Perhaps. You did give me good counsel, though." "Ha!" Sherman gulped down a bit of his drink. "You stood by me when they all thought I was crazy before Shiloh, and I stood by you when they all said you were a drunkard." Grant eyed him. "I was not a drunkard." Before Sherman could respond to that, an aide came in with a message for Grant. The weary-looking bearded man scanned the 2-page dispatch while Sherman refilled his glass. He looked up as a curse escaped Grant's lips. "Trouble?" The general tossed the notes upon his field desk. "Yes, some fool is demanding that a rebel doctor and one of his patients be arrested for insubordination, assault, and violation of the surrender." "So?" "Well, there is also an affidavit from the doctor stating that Union soldiers were stealing from the patients, and he demands I take action against them." Sherman sat back. "It happens, no matter how many orders we issue or men we arrest. If it gets too bad, we put a few in the stockade. Is there something else?" "The officer involved is a George Whitehead, attached to 13 Corps. Made captain because his father is the postmaster back in Illinois and active in the Republican Party. I've had complaints before about this fellow, but McClelland always stood by him." "You think Whitehead is guilty?" "I've no reason to trust the man." Sherman grunted. Both the Union and Confederate armies were filled with political officers, men who received their rank not because of military training or experience in battle, but because of their civilian connections. They were usually incompetent troublemakers for their professional brethren, but they had friends in high places, and it was detrimental to one's career to oppose these men without being very careful. The former 13 Corps commander, Major General John A. McClelland, had been just such a man, and it had taken Grant months to orchestrate his removal. Grant pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. "I finally got rid of McClelland, and now I must divest myself of another political officer. Damnation! I've a war to fight." "That was good work, shipping out that vainglorious fool," Sherman said as he took a sip of his whiskey. "Why not do the same with this bastard? Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Eh? What's that? Whitehead. Have him escort his precious prisoners to prison camp with a letter requesting transfer. Let him be someone else's problem. Meanwhile, you don't have to try both Whitehead and those rebels." Grant sat back. "Sherman, I knew there was a reason I let you drink my whiskey." Jackson, Mississippi, 1865. It was the end of the line, and Darcy and Bingley climbed off the train in the early evening with scores of other veterans of the late war. All about the Jackson station was damage and disarray, evidence of the 5-year cataclysm, from which the country was now trying to recover. The two needed a place for the night, but were not surprised to learn from the station master that all the available rooms were taken. Once again, they had to face a night on the cold, hard earth, and they began to search for a spot relatively safe from thieves, when they came upon a campfire. "Hello," Bingley cried to the lone figure next to the flame. "May we share your fire for a while?" The man looked up from under the broad brim of his hat, which sported a silver hatband. He wore the uniform of a major of rebel cavalry, a sharp carbine rifle close to his hand. The light from the fire was reflected in his dark eyes. "Come on in, Georgia, you and your companion, and set a spell." Bingley and Darcy sat on the opposite side of the fire, and the doctor continued to speak. "Thank you kindly, sir. But how did you know I'm from Georgia?" The stranger chuckled. "I've an ear for accents. Am I right?" Bingley confirmed he was, introduced himself and Darcy, and named a small town in Georgia as his hometown. "My name's Fitzwilliam," said the major. "What brings you this far west, Dr. Bingley?" Bingley stared at the flames. "There wasn't much left for me back at my family's plantation, Netherfield." "I take it your place was visited by Sherman and his horde?" Bingley confirmed that his family home had fallen victim to Sherman's march to the sea. "And you, Mr. Darcy, where do you hail from?" "Rosings, a little town west of Fort Worth." Fitzwilliam grinned. "Always a pleasure to meet a fellow Texican. I'm from Nacogdoches myself." Darcy narrowed his eyes. "Nacogdoches? You're wearing the uniform of the Virginia Cavalry, sir." "You've a sharp eye, Mr. Darcy. No, I didn't steal these clothes, though I did help myself to this here carbine from a Yankee trooper who had no further use for it. Help yourself to some coffee, and I'll tell you my tale." The two helped themselves to the pot. The steaming black concoction had more acorns and leaves in it than coffee, but at least it was hot. "I was orphaned at a young age, and was raised by relations on a cotton farm near Nacogdoches. My uncle had some connections in the army from the Mexican War, so I got a commission to attend the Virginia Military Institute. I was there when the war broke out and followed Stonewall Jackson to take on the foe. Riding suited me better than walking, so I hooked up with Jeb Stuart. Rode with him from Manassas to Gettysburg to Yellow Tavern." He lifted his mug. "Here's to you, old Jeb. May you rest in peace." Darcy and Bingley had a bit of food and offered to share it with Fitzwilliam. As they ate, they told stories of their war experiences. Fitzwilliam did most of the talking, as Darcy and Bingley were particularly quiet about their time as prisoners of war. Finally, Fitzwilliam asked, "So, what are your plans, Dr. Bingley?" Bingley swallowed a spoonful of beans. "Call me Charles, Fitz. Going west with Will here. He tells me there's need for a doctor in Rosings, so I'm heading to give it a try. What about you? Heading back to Nacogdoches?" "Nah, never did take to farming, to the grief of my uncle. I got an itch to ride the range, punching cattle and such. I'm heading west, going to sign on with a cattle ranch." Darcy eyed him. "Ever rode cattle, Fitz?" "Not yet." He grinned. "You offering me a job, Darcy?" "That's up to my daddy, but you can come along." "Thank you kindly, Mr. Darcy." Darcy grinned for the first time. "Good that you know your place, Fitz. Pour me some more of that black stuff you're passing off as coffee." "Hell with that," Fitz returned, as he pulled a small bottle from a saddlebag and tossed it to Darcy. "Take a snort of this." "Holding out on us, Fitz?" asked Darcy, as he took a swig. A moment later he coughed down the rot-gut whiskey, to Fitz's and Bingley's laughter. "Had to have a reason to celebrate. I've a feeling we're going to have interesting times, Darcy." Meryton, 1868. After church on Sunday, Thomas Bennet looked on his family as they ate the midday dinner. Jane at 20, his surviving eldest and in the full bloom of her beauty. Elizabeth, his darling Beth, 18 and as free-spirited as ever. Mary, almost 17, and as serious as Beth was playful. Cathy, 13 and on the cusp of womanhood. And Lily, the baby, a very pretty and precocious 12, and her mother's delight. For a moment the memory of his only son, Samuel, 5 years in a grave in Maryland, flashed before his mind. Samuel was a hole in his soul that would never heal. His eyes fell upon his cohort for the past quarter-century, his wife, Fanny. He loved her dearly, but he was not blind to her shortcomings. Never an intelligent or introspective person, she had been a gay and kind companion during the majority of their life together. But Fanny had changed since the loss of Samuel. She was now prone to fits of anxiety and, therefore, less of a guiding light to the 3 youngest than she had been to Samuel, Jane, and Beth in their youth. The children had been given free rein to indulge in their more unfortunate tendencies. Mary was unsociable. Cathy was as emotional as her mother, and Lily was terribly spoiled. Bennet was loath to admit that he bore some responsibility for this sad state of affairs. He had found young children uninteresting, and had given his attention only to his eldest. Samuel, oh Samuel, he thought again. The loss of his heir would cost his family more than they knew. Bennet cleared his throat. "My dears, I have an announcement to make." The Bennet women turned their attention to him. Bennet inwardly grimaced in anticipation of the uproar to come. "For quite a while we've lived in comfort. Working the land with my brothers has adequately provided for us these many years."
"Adequately provided?" cried his wife. "It's all right for you to say so, Thomas, if you believe having 5 unmarried daughters with no dowry to speak of adequate, or even enough money to have but 1 store-bought dress each, but I don't believe it is so."
"Indeed, my dear. And now with the return of my nephews from the war and their growing families— Forgive me, Fanny." Mrs. Bennet wiped the tear from her eye.
"Please, Thomas, say no more about that, or I will think of our poor lost Samuel again."
She could say no more as she wept, and Cathy joined in. Jane and Beth consoled the others. Mary sighed in disapproval, and Lily looked bored. Bennet held his tongue until his wife was tolerably composed. "My dear, now that our nephews are having families of their own, the Bennet farm will not produce enough for all of us. Therefore, I have spoken to my brothers, and they have agreed to buy me out."
"Buy us out? But, Thomas, what shall we do?"
Jane spoke up.
"Are you buying another farm, father?"
"Yes, I am. A place of our very own."
"We will have to leave home?"
Cathy gasped. "Yes, we will." Fanny cut him off.
"Oh, who cares about this old house? We inherited it from Grandmother Bennet. A house of our own. How delightful. Is it near the river, dear? I hope it is near the river."
Bennet glanced down at his plate. "It is near a river, Fanny." Beth frowned.
"But, father, how much did our uncles pay? Land near the river is so very dear. They surely couldn't pay that much."
"They paid enough, Beth. We will have a new farm near a river, but it will not be here."
"Not here?"
Mrs. Bennet looked at her daughters.
"But where? Is it nearby?"
"No, dear." That got Mary's attention.
"We will have to change churches?"
"I am afraid so, child."
"I know," Mrs. Bennet claimed. "You always knew I favored the next county. So lovely, and I have family there." "Pooh! I don't care for them," cried Lily. "Last time we visited, the boys pulled my hair." "That was 3 years ago," said Jane gently. "Surely they will be kinder now."
Bennet raised his voice. "Please, enough of this. We are not moving to the next county." The women all stared at him. "I have found a wonderful place where we can grow vegetables and corn almost year-round and still have room for cattle."
"Year-round? Thomas, you tease me. One cannot grow vegetables in Ohio in winter."
"One can in Rosings."
"Rosings? I never heard of such a place. Where in Ohio is this paradise?"
Bennet took a breath. "It is not in Ohio. It is in Texas." Bennet was surprised. The room was quiet much longer than he anticipated, but the explosion that followed was all he expected.
"Texas!"
Beth cried again for the countless time.
"How can Father make us all go to Texas?"
Jane sighed as she brushed Beth's hair, their nightly routine before bed.
"He's doing the best he can. The farm he described is large enough to take care of all our needs. We'll have farm hands to help. It sounds delightful."
Beth was not appeased.
"If Samuel were here, he would talk Father out of this." "Beth, if Samuel were here, we might be buying out our uncles. But he is not. We must try to persevere. Father needs our support, not our censure."
Beth bit her lip as she recalled her mother's unkind exclamations at table.
"You're right. Father is trying to care for us. But, oh, Jane, Texas? I can't believe it. I hate it." "It is very far away from here, that's true. It's not Texas that I'm talking about, but the Texans. I haven't forgotten that they turned their backs on the Union and most disgracefully took up arms against us, all to preserve their vile practice of slavery. Beth, we are taught to forgive. Perhaps they have seen the wickedness of their ways and have repented."
"Perhaps," Beth said, but to herself she thought,
"You may forgive them, Jane, for you are good. But I will never forget that if not for them, Samuel would still be alive. I will never forgive them. Never."
Chapter 1. Rosings, Texas, September 1870. A lone figure sat astride a tall black Arabian under a single oak tree atop a ridge. It was a hot day, and in the early afternoon sun, the shade was welcomed by horse and rider alike, standing as still as a statue. He was a tall man in a white shirt with dark trousers and black boots, his unbuttoned vest flapping in the slight breeze, a tan, wide-brimmed, 10-gallon hat pulled low over his brow. Before him stretched a sea of prairie, dotted with hundreds of cattle, lowing and grazing. They were not alone. A handful of wranglers carefully moved their cow ponies around the vast herd, keeping an eye out for trouble. The movement of the horses disturbed the man's mount, and he reached down to gently stroke its neck. "Whoa there, Caesar, rest easy," William Darcy cooed. "We'll just stay here under the shade for now. Enjoy the cool." The stallion nodded his head in apparent agreement and bent to take a few nibbles of grass. The man's attention returned to the scene before him, his bright blue eyes taking in every detail. A flash of moving white caught his attention. He turned away from his perusal of the herd and twisted in the saddle. There, across the ridge of hills, was a rider, moving fast. Darcy narrowed his eyes in concentration. The horse was a brown and white paint, and none of his riders had such a horse. A stranger on his land. Caesar began to prance in place, feeling his master's tension through the reins. The rider seemed to be alone, and while Darcy had left his gun belt and Colt revolver at the house, he did have a rifle holstered to his saddle. "What say we go check that out, boy?" The horse agreed, and they loped down the hill. Darcy moved at an angle to the stranger, holding Caesar back until necessary. The intruder was at a full gallop, flying across the crest. Darcy lost sight of the paint as he reached the valley between the hills, and he allowed Caesar his head. The stallion dug in and moved quickly up the rise, and Darcy saw with confidence that he was in the proper position to cut off the paint. Caesar spotted his quarry and headed toward the other horse, waiting for direction from his master. As they grew closer, Darcy could see that the rider and paint moved in perfect harmony. The horse was rather small, but so was the rider. A boy, Darcy thought, before noticing the wild, curly hair flying on either side of the rider's hat. As Darcy pulled to a halt, blocking the paint's progress, a shock of realization coursed through him. That's no boy. That's a girl. A girl in men's clothing. He pulled his hand away from his rifle, and, unarmed, raised his palm in an unmistakable sign. "Hold on, miss." The surprised girl came to a halt a few feet away, dust swirling in the breeze. She had on a red and white gingham shirt and dungarees, boots firmly in the stirrups. She wore a wide-brimmed floppy hat, shading her face, but even at that distance he could see her blazing eyes. "What do you want?" Her voice was lower than Darcy expected from so short a person. She could not be more than 5 feet 2 inches, but it was not unpleasant to his ears, though it was northern and unfriendly. Darcy was not used to answering demands from anyone in the last 4 years, and he wasn't going to change for some strange female. "Who are you?" he demanded. "This is private property. Who gave you leave to ride across Pemberley?"
"Private?"
It was clear he surprised her.
"All this? I thought this was open range."
"Not hardly. Everything this side of the Long Branch belongs to Pemberley Ranch." He considered her. "You're not from around here, are you?" The girl raised her chin.
"We are now. Our place is across the river. My father owns the farm there."
Darcy relaxed a bit. "The old Thompson place?" She answered with a nod. "You're one of Tom Bennet's daughters? I was told he had a herd of them." Almost immediately he recognized how his choice of words would be considered an insult, but it was too late. The girl's voice was ice-cold.
"Tom Bennet is indeed my father, sir, and I thank you for your kind observations about my family. Now, if you'll pardon me—"
She pulled her reins to return from whence she came, only to be halted by Darcy's words. "I'll escort you back to the ford, miss, if you don't mind." She looked over her shoulder at him.
"I do mind. You've made it clear that I'm not welcomed here, and I can see myself home. Good day."
To her increased irritation, Darcy fell in beside her.
"I see there was no cause for me to voice my preference."
"The ground is uneven here, and as it's unfamiliar to you, you might meet with misfortune."
"So, I cannot ride my horse? Is that what you mean?"
Darcy snapped back. "I truly don't wish to offend, miss, but you're being mighty stubborn. Your pony might fall into some gopher hole and break his leg and have to be put down. Now I call that a tall price to pay for your pride." The girl said nothing. She only lowered her head. But Darcy could see the color rise on her cheek as she bit her lip. The two rode in silence for some time along the ridgeline, before turning right and making their way down to the river. The trees grew more plentiful and thick next to the riverbank. Darcy tried to come up with some conversation, but the girl's studied avoidance of his glance stilled his tongue. After a few more minutes, they reached a shallow ford across the Long Branch. "Well, here we are. Thompson Crossing. Your daddy's farm's on the other side? I reckon this is how you crossed over?" The girl's sarcastic side reasserted itself.
"It is. Thank you so much for assuring I didn't cause Turner any injury. I am forever grateful."
Darcy blinked. "Turner? Your horse's name is Turner." A grin stole across her face.
"It is, sir."
"Strange. Most girls name their ponies Star, or Brownie, or Buster." Her grin turned into a mocking smile.
But I'm not like most girls, as I'm sure you've discovered."
With that, she spurred the paint across the ford, splashing water everywhere, leaving a bemused Darcy behind. He shook his head before turning Caesar back toward the Pemberley ranch house. It was only then he realized that he had neglected to introduce himself. "No harm done," he thought. "It's not likely we'll meet up again." The girl in the wide-brimmed hat had just dismounted next to the barn when she heard her mother's call.
"Beth Bennet, there you are. Come inside and change this instant. There's company for dinner."
"Yes, Mother." She led Turner into his stall and removed his saddle. Hill, the farmhand, assured her he would see to the paint, so Beth hurried to the house and into the bedroom she shared with two of her sisters.
"Beth, you're late,"
said Mary unnecessarily as she was putting her own hair up.
"I'll help you,"
said Jane, as Beth tugged off her shirt. In a few moments, Beth had changed from farm tomboy to countrified young lady. By then, Kathy had joined them, brushing her hair as Jane helped button up the younger girl's dress.
"Hurry!" cried Lily. "George is just arriving." "Lily," scolded Mary, "that's Mr. Whitehead. You should have more respect for your elders." "Oh, pooh! He's like family. He gave me leave to call him George, didn't he, Kathy?" "Oh, yes," Kathy responded with a dreamy look in her eye. "Isn't he the handsomest man?" "I don't know," Beth said as she glanced at Jane. "What say you, Jane?" Jane gave a smile. "He's very handsome, to be sure." Kathy laughed. "But not the most handsome, is he? Not like a certain doctor in town?" Giggles erupted as Jane blushed. The door opened and Mrs. Bennet stuck her head in. "Girls, come along. Mr. Whitehead is here. Ah, Beth, you're almost ready. Hurry, hurry." "I'll help her, Mother," Jane assured her. "The others can greet our guest." With that, Lily and Kathy almost ran out of the room, Mary following at a more sedate pace. Jane helped Beth finish her hair. "There, beautiful as usual." Beth laughed. "Oh, Jane, you are too good. The only way I can be called beautiful is if you're not in the room." "That's ridiculous. You are very pretty, and one day a young man will fall on his knees, assuring you of your loveliness when he asks for your hand. Just mark my words." Beth laughed. "Is that what Charles did, dearest?" She laughed again as Jane blushed for a second time, but the laughter died a moment later. "Why did he refuse our invitation to dinner tonight?" Jane pretended to arrange the brushes on the table. "Charles said he had pressing business and he would dine with us tomorrow." "Jane, you know he stays away just because George is our guest for dinner. Why is he so stubborn? Surely he must accept our friends if he is to marry you. George is a brave and honorable man. To hold the fact that he fought for the Union against him is very unseemly, I'm sorry to say. Why haven't we forgiven him for being a rebel?" Jane glanced at Beth, her mouth a firm line. "I will not question my fiancé, sister. I shall be loyal to Charles." Slightly abashed, Beth took Jane's hands into her own. "As shall I promise. He is to be my brother, and I will love him as such. I just worry over the influence of others on him." "You mean his friends, the Darcys?" "Yes. You've heard what George has said about them. Unrepentant rebels, unfriendly to anyone not in the intimate circle." "I've heard that Mr. Darcy has taken the loyalty oath." "Oh, Jane, what comes out of his mouth is not what's in his heart, I can assure you. He has only taken the oath, I can believe, to be allowed to vote again. But he hasn't changed one whit. Why, none of us has ever met him or his sister. Even you haven't, and you are to marry his best friend. And just today, one of his ranch hands warned me off his property." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. He wasn't unpleasant, I hope." "Very," Beth claimed, trying not to recall that the rude man on the Arabian was also
undeniably fine-looking. At Jane's alarmed look, she quickly added, "But he was polite all the same. I'm unharmed." She rose, and they moved towards the door. "Beth," said her sister in a worried tone, "I'm sorry you will have to stand with Mr. Darcy at my wedding, but Charles has no family here, and the man is his friend. Don't fear, Jane. For your happiness I would do anything, even suffer Mr. Darcy, and I truly adore your Charles. Now, shall we go to dinner?" George Whitehead patted his mouth with his napkin. "Mrs. Bennet, may I say once again what a marvelous table you set. A better dinner I have not had these 4 years since I left Illinois." Fanny Bennet giggled like a schoolgirl.
"Oh, Mr. Whitehead, how you go on! Would you care for more of the beef? Pass in the plate, Cathy. Cathy, I'm speaking to you."
Cathy Bennet stirred from her admiration for their dashing guest.
"I'm sorry, Mother. What did you say?"
Lily unsuccessfully hid a snigger, which earned a glare from her sister.
The meat! The meat! Pass the plate to Mr. Whitehead."
Dear, perhaps Cathy should wait until George has finished his portion," suggested Mr. Bennet. "Yes," replied Whitehead smoothly, "but I shall certainly take seconds." Beth nearly rolled her eyes at their guest's embroidered gallantry. As much as she liked George Whitehead, he could lay on the compliments a bit too thickly for her taste. But as he meant to compliment her mother, his bit of foolishness was forgiven at once, and the man was devilishly handsome with his dark hair, elegantly styled Van Dyke, and impeccably tailored clothes. Yes, a person with whom it was very difficult to be exasperated. As Mr. Bennet preferred to listen rather than lead the conversation about table, it fell to Whitehead to steer the discussion. "Miss Jane, I am sure you are looking forward to next month's nuptials?"
"I am, George, thank you."
Beth had hoped she would bring up the antipathy between Charles and George, but she was disappointed. "My best wishes for your felicity. And you, Miss Beth, still enjoy riding all over creation on Thomas?" Beth hid a smirk. Not only had George failed to understand the hidden joke of her horse's name, most people did, he had forgotten it completely.
"Turner, sir, yes. I was just riding this afternoon, in fact, and I was most rudely treated by our neighbor."
That caught Bennet's attention. "What happened, my dear?" Whitehead was more solicitous. "I hope you were not mistreated by a B&R employee, Miss Beth?"
"Oh, no, it was a rider from Pemberley. I had not realized that they owned all of the land across the river. While enjoying my ride, I was intercepted, warned off the land, and escorted off. Why, you'd think I was a cattle rustler by the way I was treated."
"Were you mistreated, Beth?" her father demanded. "I won't stand for it. Did anyone threaten you?" Beth realized she had overstated the case, and tried to put the company at ease.
"Father, I misspoke. I was indeed informed that I was trespassing, but I must admit that I suffered no hurt to my person, only my feelings. I was not mistreated either by words or actions. Besides receiving a scolding, I have no complaints, save that I must remain on this side of the river."
"How rude!" cried Mrs. Bennet in maternal solidarity.
"To treat any child of mine so! Tom, you should have a talk with Mr. Darcy about the character of his men."
Whitehead shook his head. "I'm not certain that would have any effect, Mrs. Bennet. Recall that I know the Darcys well, and they do not take kindly to others telling them how to run their business. I myself, after having extended the offer of friendship to that family, have also been, as Miss Beth so elegantly put it, warned off Pemberley. Who was the man that accosted you, Miss Beth?"
"Accosted is a bit strong, George. As I said, my ride was interrupted by a Pemberley rider, but he didn't offer his name."
"I'll wager I can guess the man. Ruddy-faced man on a brown quarter horse. wearing a black hat with a silver hatband?" Beth shook her head.
"No, he was tall with a tan hat. Dark hair and clean-shaven, and his horse was black."
Whitehead stared at her. His eyes. Did you note the color of his eyes? Beth licked her lips. She had left that part out, for they were the most intense eyes she had ever beheld. But she would not be reticent.
"Blue. Bright blue."
Whitehead let out a bark of laughter. "Why, Miss Beth, you've met the man himself. That was William Darcy, esteemed owner of Pemberley Ranch, Darcy Bank, and half of Long Branch County. Do you not feel fortunate at such a meeting?" Beth could not help stealing a glance at Jane. Sure enough, her sister was red in the face with mortification. For the sake of her feelings, Beth labored to diffuse the situation.
"I'm always happy to meet new people, George, but I can't vouch for others. As he said, it's his land, and I shall respect that, no matter how little I respect him."
"Well said, my dear," injected her father. "We should always respect other people's property." George did not take the hint to change the subject. "It's not surprising that you didn't know who he was, for he is a rather peculiar fellow. He's practically a hermit, and he keeps his sister close to Pemberley with him. Have you never seen him in town?"
"No, none of us have,"
Beth replied. Mary decided to have her share of the conversation.
"We certainly have not seen them in church on Sunday, unlike other respectable members of the community."
"How like Mary to note that," Beth considered, but it was true. The Darcys did not attend services at the church in town, while Cate Burroughs and her daughter Anne made a very notable procession every Sunday to their reserved pew in the front. Sheriff Lucas, Dr. Bingley, and George Whitehead were all members in good standing of Reverend Henry Tilney's congregation. "Well," Whitehead grinned, "we are commanded to be faithful, yet we are all poor sinners. But what can you expect from a man who has taken up arms against his country?" Beth winced a little at the latest disparagement of Darcy, knowing how it would give Jane pain, as the same could be said of Charles. Finally, Mr. Bennet roused himself to take control of his dinner table. "Any news from town, George? We've been very busy here with harvest time upon us." "Yes, a new family has just moved in east of town in the new settlement, the Washingtons, a former slave family from Louisiana, looking for a better life out here." Bennet frowned. "East of town, George? You mean that land near the river?" "That's the place." Bennet pursed his lips. "It's a bit low there, don't you think? Wouldn't you say that land's prone to flooding?" Whitehead stared at Bennet for a moment, his face made of stone. He blinked, and a shy grin grew across his face. "Well, I'm no expert about that, Tom. I'm only the recorder of deeds. Mrs. Burroughs sells the land, but I've been here 4 years, and I've never seen any flooding in the new settlements." Bennet shrugged his shoulders as he sipped his coffee. "If you say so, George."
"Well," cried Mrs. Bennet, "if everyone's finished. No seconds, Mr. Whitehead? Are you sure? Well then, girls, help me clear the table for dessert. Blackberry cobbler."
William and Gabrielle Darcy walked the small man in the black cassock to his carriage. "I'm pleased you could join us for dinner, Father." Father Joseph smiled as he spoke in a heavy Spanish accent. "No, my son, it is I who should thank you, your sister, and most particularly your cook, Mrs. Reynolds."
"Oh, Father,"
said Gabby,
"you're welcome any time."
She curtsied as he took first her hand and then her brother's, before making the sign of the cross over them in blessing. "May our Father bless you and all here." The priest climbed into his carriage. "Go with God, Padre," Will shouted as the brother and sister waved in farewell. "That there's a good man, even if he does wear a dress," drawled Richard Fitzwilliam, leaning on a column next to the steps leading down from the veranda.
"Maybe you should come to Mass with us sometimes, Fitz," said Gabby. "It'll do you good."
Fitz laughed. "Me? All that kneeling and bowing and such? Thank you kindly, Miss Gabby, but that ain't for me." Gabby shook her head in fond resignation as she continued into the house. Will and Fitz sat down in 2 rocking chairs on the veranda and lit cigars. "Heard about the latest homesteaders come to town?" Fitz began. "Former slaves bought some of that bottom land from your cousin, like the rest of them." Darcy closed his eyes for a moment. "Damn." "Yeah." Fitz took a puff. "Don't know how folks round here will cotton to a family of former slaves moving in." Darcy glanced at his friend and ranch foreman. "You've got a point, Fitz, but that's not what I meant. You're not from around here. There's a reason that land's lay fallow till now. It's low and prone to flooding. I remember back in '55 when the Long Branch came up from its banks after a heavy storm. It's been dry ever since, but that won't last. We get one big rain, those people in the new settlement will have 3 to 4 feet of water in their homes." "Your cousin, Mrs. Burroughs, must know that. Why is she selling?" "Oldest reason in the world, money. Whitehead and that fancy-pants bank manager of hers, Collins, talked Cate into it." "You could talk her out of it." Darcy stared out onto his land, his features set. "Nope. That isn't my concern anymore. I learned my lesson in the war, Fitz. I worry only about my family, my people, and Pemberley. Everything else can see to itself." The 2 finished their cigars in silence. "Ah, here you are, Beth," said her father, as he walked into his study.
"Yes, I was reading and keeping Samuel company."
Beth was in an armchair near the bookcase, an old lamp on the side table, and the precious lone photograph of Samuel that had been taken before his departure, with the rest of the Ohio troops lovingly hung on the adjoining wall. Bennet walked up to it, sighing. "You know, I think Samuel would have liked Texas," he observed before turning to her. "You've certainly changed your mind about the place." Beth put down her book.
"Texas is a lovely place."
She then smiled impishly.
"If only it wasn't full of Texans."
Bennet laughed. "Now, that's not quite true. You've made great friends with Miss Charlotte Lucas, the sheriff's daughter. Reverend Tilney's a good man." He paused. "You're not holding the war against Doc Bingley, are you?" Beth bit her lip.
"No, how can I? He makes Jane so happy."
"Don't you like him for yourself?" Beth colored.
"I do, it's just—"
She glanced at Samuel's portrait.
"I feel as if I'm betraying Samuel's memory."
Bennet laid a hand on her shoulder. "Beth, you've got to try to forget about the war."
"I try, but I'm afraid if I do, I'll forget Samuel."
Bennet just shook his head. "Well, I'm going to bed, my dear. Don't stay up too late." He kissed the top of her head and left. Beth watched him go, and then turned her eyes to the photograph. Softly to herself, she repeated her vow.
"I'll not forget you, Samuel, no matter what the others do. I'll stay true, just watch. I'll never forget you."
With that she extinguished the light and left the room for bed. Chapter 2. October 1870. I hereby pronounce you man and wife. What God hath joined, let no man tear asunder. The Reverend Henry Tilney then raised his hands to the congregation. Friends, let me present to you Dr. and Mrs. Charles Bingley. To general applause, the happy couple walked down the aisle, Bingley in his best blue suit, and Jane in a store-bought dress ordered direct from St. Louis. Behind them was a slightly less joyous couple, maid of honor Beth Bennet and best man William Darcy. The newlyweds, their family, and friends proceeded by foot to the only place in Rosings large enough for a reception, Young's Saloon. Sally Young, proprietor and madam of the place, promised that her working girls would be gone from the premises for the duration of the festivities, to the relief of the Bennets and the despair of some of the male townsfolk. True to her word to her sister, Beth had said not a single disparaging word to her escort, although she dearly wished to. She was uncomfortable, and not just because of the words spoken to her a month ago by the man now walking beside her. They still stung, and Beth was loath to either forgive or forget. But what made matters worse was how downright handsome the man was. Darcy was impeccable in his suit. Not a hair was out of place, and his smell, a subtle yet wondrous aroma, filled her nostrils whenever he stood near, a far finer smell than the eau de cologne favored by George Whitehead. Beth tried valiantly not to look into his face, for a man with his blue eyes was far too dangerous. Darcy, too, was in turmoil. To his dismay, he realized the tomboy to whom he had been so short was the Bennet girl he was obligated to stand with at Charles's wedding. She was quite simply the fairest girl he had ever seen. True, Jane Bennet, now Mrs. Bingley, was as lovely as Charles had claimed, but Darcy's eye would not leave the woman beside him. All the Bennet girls were pretty in their own right, but Darcy was enchanted by the fire in Beth Bennet's eyes. A man could get lost there, he knew, and he vowed not to allow himself to be tempted. The party soon reached their destination, and the place was quickly filled, for in as small a town as Rosings, one could not have a wedding and not invite the entire population. The piano player took his seat, and Charles and Jane waltzed for the first time as a married couple. Darcy and Beth watched, in admiration on his part, and apprehension on hers, for the last duty of their joint office was to dance the second dance. Darcy decided to make conversation. "Your sister looks very happy, Miss Beth." Beth resolutely stared at the couple dancing. "Yes. When we moved here, I'm sure we had no thought that Jane would meet so agreeable a person as Dr. Bingley." "She's very fortunate. Charles is a good man." Beth was glad at his statement, for the implied suggestion that Jane was a husband-hunter gave her a reason to let loose her animosity towards Darcy. "Indeed. I'm glad you think so. I know my family feels the same. However, knowing Jane as I do, it is my decided opinion that Charles is getting the best of the bargain. There's no one so good as my sister." Before Darcy could respond, the music ended, and he was occupied applauding the couple. He then reached out for Beth's hand, and the two of them joined the Bingleys and the Bennets for a dance. Another waltz began, and Darcy took Beth's left hand in his right, placed his left on her wrist, and whispered, "Just follow my lead, Miss Bennet, if you're unsure of the steps." Beth was forced to bite her tongue, for it would not do to make a scene at Jane's wedding, no matter how insufferable this tall, handsome, pompous ass could be. Not trusting herself, she refused to talk to him during the whole of the dance. She glanced at him occasionally, and for the first time noticed a faint scar on his forehead. Darcy took her silence as evidence of her nervousness, and did not press her for conversation. The assembled watched.